to today's presentation with Julia McIntosh and Jesse Bailey. And this presentation is called Mad Studies, Psychosis, and Solidarity. I know for myself, I'm really excited for this presentation and look forward to the information that these presenters are going to be giving us today. So welcome. Julia and Jesse are going to introduce themselves. So I'll give the platform to you two.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah, I'm Jesse, and we're both students on the Masters in Mad Studies program at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh in Scotland. This program has been running for 3 years. We're both in the final cohort of students as the program recently has been suspended. If Julia would talk.
Yeah, I'll explain more. It's not actually suspended. It's under review with a number of other courses in the university. They're doing a review of sustainability of academic courses, as universities do, and Mad Studies is one of the courses that they're looking at. And so they've suspended the intake of students for this upcoming year and put it all on pause. But it's not, the course itself isn't suspended. So we just need to be very clear that it's we've got this, the slide says Save Mad Studies at QMU, and that was because the petition platform said, make your petition sound very dramatic. And so we made it sound very dramatic, but we would love for everybody to sign the petition, help us support the, the plea to keep it going. And yeah, so thank you.
Just to expand a bit, talking a bit about our own backgrounds. My own background is sort of, I studied politics for undergraduate and then was a teacher in secondary school, international school, teaching social science for several years. I then specifically, I had a near-death experience in Cuba in 2019. And since then, I've kind of had a somewhat difficult relationship with consensus reality, I guess. But partly because I work with children and in education, there's still a lot of stigma surrounding this kind of experience. So I prefer not to share too much into the whole experience there. But, pretty much everybody on this Mad Studies program has some kind of lived experience with these kinds of things.
Yeah, I do as well. And I'm not from Edinburgh. I'm from Chicago originally, but I've been here in Scotland for 25 years and discovered the Mad Studies program last year. Found it in my backyard, which was very exciting, and have joined with exactly as Jesse said, with lived experience sort of being my motivation.
And so we're talking all about Mad Studies here, and probably some people in the audience have no idea. Maybe some of you have sort of looked it up and found the Wikipedia page or whatever, which is actually quite good and gives a good overview, I think. But many people, particularly when you're studying this as a master's and people ask you what you're studying and you say Mad Studies, the overwhelming majority of people are like, what on earth are you talking about? Usually people think, is that an acronym for something? Which sometimes I've said to people, yeah, it's like, because the classic acronym in international relations is MAD, means mutually assured destruction. And I actually think that's probably quite a good way of describing what the objective of Mad Studies might be, in the sense of the mutually assured destruction of sort of madness and sanity as a way of dividing up experience, but also sort of the mutually assured destruction of psychiatry and the institutions that support that, perhaps.
Well, and it's interesting because that's Mad Studies is a very open and flexible space, and there are threads of anti-psychiatry, there are threads of abolition, and but there's a lot of room for discussion and a lot of room for nuance. That's something that really appeals to me about the course, is that, and frustrates me as well, that it's not easy to pin down what is Mad Studies, because as a project, it has hesitated to pin itself down into, pigeonhole itself into an academic discipline. It's
Yeah, I mean, similarly, it doesn't even necessarily pin itself, and this is a problem that I've had or other students have also had, is that it doesn't necessarily consistently pin itself down to a commitment to non-violence, for example. There are people who sort of continue to accept that sort of psychiatric violence is necessary or so forth in a Mad Studies context, or that medication is an appropriate response, or that forced medication might be required, and so forth. And personally, I find that problematic, and I think there should be a pronounced sort of commitment to non-violence on the part of Mad Studies, and that one of its crucial objectives should be the end of violence in relation to any of these kinds of experiences that are labeled mad. But people disagree about that in the Mad Studies context, and that's fine. It's useful to have a space in which these discussions can be had regardless.
absolutely. We've got on the slide these different sort of talking points, and I want to draw your attention to paradigm shift, because I think probably that is something that everyone in the Mad Studies program that I've encountered is in agreement that what we are seeking is paradigm shift, and how to go about achieving that is more open and flexible, but it is a space for critiquing and a space for dialogue. And it has, I think, very successfully provided a space that I was delighted to find. I think it's a fairly young discipline, and it's still finding its way. So
also a sort of, it's a sort of non-discipline also in the sense that it challenges the idea of a discipline. It's transdisciplinary in the sense of sort of abandoning discipline as, crucially, the point is that Mad Studies points to this dividing line between what is rational, irrational, what is sane, what is mad. And we can already acknowledge that the academy already, or the academic, is already clearly on one side of that dividing line, and defends sort of, much of the time, defends a certain notion of rationality and subjectivity and identity and all of these things, so forth, that sort of is incompatible most of the time with things. This is why recently, in an essay I wrote recently, I was sort of saying that Mad Studies supersedes the academy, crucially, actually, because its focus point is this dividing line between what's rational, what's irrational, and the academy already falls within this dividing line by being a defender of rationality. Anyway.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think as students, we have all struggled within the program to navigate that tension in terms of the expectations that the academy places on scholarship, and just the hoops to jump, and the tension between bringing in lived experience and
various casualties as a result of that. There's been various casualties in the program in terms of people dropping out and or not being heard, really, because of the academic constraints that are required in regards to the production and communication of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely, that's true.
Just crucially before we move on, the central to Mad Studies is this idea of centering lived experience, of and the drawing particularly on people who have experience of, what is labeled as mad, which includes psychosis. It may well include other things, because the problem is that problem of just sort of focusing on psychosis, and I do that a lot in my own work, but that the problem is psychosis is also just a construct of psychiatry, just as schizophrenia or any of the other things are. ADHD, autism, these are all sort of products of psychiatric knowledge, and you don't want to allow the framing to be trapped in the systems that have already that are providing those labels. So MAD is much more broad and sociological, really, than it is psychological or any of these other things. Okay.
Let's move on
So
to
the key,
yeah.
so the key thing that we want to talk about today was, what does Mad Studies contribute to life, to the world, really? And we're going to do that just by drawing on something. I invented this kind of model approach to education because I'm very interested in this, that sort of thinks about the classroom in terms of 4 dimensions or 5 dimensions, just thinking about the dimensions of the classroom. It's kind of a bit like mad knowledge. At least that's the place it comes from. And there's this idea in Mad Studies too that we should also be involved in a kind of maddening of the academy, a maddening of society. This kind of is similar to what goes on in sort of queer studies, where we're thinking about like queering things, which is to say sort of like breaking with the binary identities that structure reality in those spaces, and sort of disrupting things in a way, and experimenting things, challenging things in discordant new ways that sort of open things up, perhaps, or don't, maybe. So this kind of was in that realm of ideas. I won't get into the details of it, but this is the whole model. Architecting, educating. We're just going to use one dimension of this, which is the vertical dimension, which I use to explore like levels of analysis. So it's quite basic, really. But I mean, the idea is that we're going to talk through this question and have audience participation in questions, but we're going to physically change our physical position whilst we do that. And this is just an invitation to the audience. If you are unable to do this or don't want to, then of course don't participate. But I strongly encourage you to do this. We become so wedded to like structures, furniture, chairs, architectures are so constraining in terms of the imposition that they make on our thought processes and body and mind body. Part of the idea behind this model is also sort of de-dichotomizing mind body, bringing it back together, realizing that there's, if you move your body, you think differently. But much of the time we're stuck at a desk, and this constrains our thinking in many profound ways. So we're going to move through these positions as we discuss these things. So, I mean, even with, and this is to say, let's jump to the personal level first. So I'm going to get out of my chair. I'm going to put my laptop on the floor. Because it's a laptop, it can be moved rather than be wedded to a desk. And I hope the audience can join us lying down. Obviously, it can be difficult for some people.
I'm staying in a friend's flat who hasn't moved this carpet for years, so you can see my dedication to this principle. Lying on the floor.
So lying on the floor. So we're going to just have a little bit of a chat for 5 minutes, and then we're going to ask the audience questions, contributions at this level. So we're thinking about this question: what does Mad Studies contribute? So one of the key things that we wanted to talk about at this personal level was what Mad Studies has contributed to us and our own experiences, and how it's opened things up. What would you say in response to that, Julia?
Well, I think epistemic injustice is a term that I learned in the Mad Studies course, and it's for anyone that doesn't know what this term means, although I suspect people at this conference are aware of it, but it's the idea that your voice isn't necessarily heard by power structures. I think that's a way of, in a nutshell, that the voice is that power doesn't listen to us. Is what it amounts to. And I think reclaiming a personal voice has been so crucial to so many people with lived experience. And the Mad Studies course, learning about the ideas that are presented in Mad Studies in a more formal way, has really enlightened and engaged people, and really shed new light on their personal experiences. It can be tricky, it can be triggering, but it is absolutely a opening process. on a
Yeah,
personal
I mean, I
level.
think also personally for me, I think one of the crucial things that Mad Studies does is current. I mean, if we think about current discourses as they are surrounding sort of psychosis or altered experience or things that we label as mad, much of the time these discourses that we have available to us to actually understand and interpret our experience are really not very helpful to people. Most of the time, you know, at least within the sort of biomedical model, these are pathological. You know, that if I just accept the standard psychiatric model of an altered experience of psychosis, then I'm wrapped up in thinking about it in terms of it being somehow disordered, of pathology, of all the negativity surrounding that. I don't have a framework available to me that's open enough to actually sort of engage with the experience that isn't distorted by this biomedical framework that actually has a direct impact on the experience itself. And there's quite a few people working in this area now. This is, I guess, it's more sort of hermeneutical injustice, but like we need more open frameworks for dealing with these experiences, because the frameworks we have literally define and structure the experience itself in ways that it just isn't helpful to anybody. And Mad Studies can open up this space in which, you know, there's a much greater freedom and openness with regards to understanding these experiences. Particularly in my own work, I'm very interested in sort of, at the moment, psychosis is usually framed either in terms of biomedical reductionism or spiritual awakening, kind of, in most of the sort of narratives at the moment. And both of those are quite heavy. They're heavy discourses. They're very sort of demanding for people having the experience in a way that perhaps we need a framework for approaching madness that isn't so over serious, isn't so heavy and laden with all of these things, that it can be a bit more sort of playful. Basically, I'm very interested in opening up in terms of play. And so yeah, anyway, but Mad Studies gives you this space to do this, and also sort of, you know, it kind of validates your experience in a certain way, but it just gives you this freedom to actually approach things without being wrapped up in, you know, pathology or meaning or whatever. And that's just crucial in doing that.
Very validating. It's very validating course. I found that I think people in the course feel that their experience is respected and validated in a way that doesn't happen very easily in other arenas. Yeah.
I mean, the danger that we have in that is, I mean, which we'll probably talk about in the next section, is sort of that you don't want sort of like the legitimacy of these ideas or this space to be justified in relation to the academy. You know, that somehow, because it's got academic legitimacy, it somehow validates things, you know, that the academy is necessary for validation, which, I mean, I guess it's helpful in some sense that it's entered that space, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, at the same time, it's sort of like these are valid regardless of what the academy says, and regardless of, you know.
Well, that's what I meant. I didn't mean it in terms of the academy validating. I meant in terms of the ideas we're learning, validating the experience, and the opening up and the exploring and the finding of community. Again, solidarity is the theme of the conference, and so there's certainly a you know, there is a solidarity in Mad Studies in terms of people becoming vulnerable together and bringing their vulnerability into a space that is looked at quite carefully and discussed and you know,
yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, but then it's not, but then as we said sort of earlier, that it's sort of pluralistic, you know, in that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't demand, you know, one specific position or anything. Everything's open. There's people, you know, there's people in this space who sort of almost totally accept psychiatry or accept a biomedical approach. There's people that radically disagree with that, but there's this assumption that there are multiple ways to interpret these experiences, and or they have, you know, that we can enter into a space that free from the idea that these need to be imposed on other people.
Yeah. Let's open up to the audience. We've got 5 minutes left for this level, so let's open up to the group and see if anyone wants to contribute. Anyone? I can't see everyone on my screen. I can only see a few of
Any
us.
questions or any thoughts about thinking about Mad Studies from this personal level, individual level, and how this can
Any
help
thoughts about
people,
lying
even
on the
just as
floor?
a simple. I enjoyed doing online conversations from the floor.
I'm waiting for the cat to come and start nudging me.
I guess the other thing is sort of like, well, I think you brought it up earlier, Julia, but the fact that Mad Studies actually can be, it's also very challenging for people. I mean, a good friend of ours, who dropped off the course because, it was just proving too really sort of re-traumatizing, really, to go. I mean, I know I'm writing about stuff at the moment too that's sort of quite traumatic, and when you look back through it, and it puts you under a lot of pressure to go over and study these things and engage with these ideas in ways, and it's not easy much of the time.
That's true.
I have a question in the chat. How do you integrate playfulness into your work?
Well, at the moment, I've been writing a lot about. I'm also a play worker at the moment. So it's very interesting to observe. I mean, this is specific with children, but very interesting to observe children and how they get lost in play, or how their play is sometimes interrupted or suspended. Actually, today I just had the experience that there was a child playing with some bats. He was playing with some tennis rackets and he was hitting things and hitting a tree. And then somebody in his neighborhood, because it's kind of, I work in sort of fairly deprived neighborhoods for a charity, and they observed this child hitting a tree with the bats and were just they were really clearly didn't think this was, basically she came over and she said, that's not how you use tennis bats. You can't use them for doing those things. They must be used to hit balls. And so this idea of sort of like shutting down, she really wanted to shut down this child's play. And I think there's something very similar about the way that psychotic experience is shut down by our society. It's fundamentally the same kind of gesture where there's this discordance with expectation and predictability, and that's fundamentally what's being shut down, is that there's this play movement going on. You can, if you want to read what I've been writing about play, it's available on my website, but it's quite
interesting.
Not many people have written about it, and so it's kind of interesting area. Yeah.
And it's also traditionally studied in context of children, and very, very rarely in the context of adulthood. And yet adults have just as much capacity to play and be creative and be silly and do things, to step outside the box. But
yeah, it stems, as you said, that whole idea stems from personal sort of experience of how I related to some, altered states or whatever, as I think that profoundly playful. And when you talk to other people who have had similar experiences, lots of people seem to share the idea that there's something playful about it, even if it can be terrifying and extremely difficult and demanding. And perhaps that play points to a discourse that isn't romanticizing, but also sort of more open and challenging. I don't know.
Well, the cat is approaching,
Anyway,
and
should we move on?
We need to move on. Yeah, it's time to move on to the next level.
Okay, so sitting cross-legged. This is just looking at local level, so thinking about Mad Studies in relation to the community. Julia, do you want to just tell them a bit about what we've been doing in relation to this?
Yeah, we've been hosting meetups through the meetup platform, and in Edinburgh and also in Glasgow, which is about an hour from here. And it's really fascinating in terms of we've had so many people signing up and being intrigued with the group idea, but we haven't had we've had variable numbers of people actually attending, and I don't know if that's so much to do with scheduling. I think it's partly a meetup phenomenon that people will just sign up to things that look interesting but don't necessarily engage more fully. We've got a group of about 10 of us that meet regularly, and somebody asked me recently what happens in these meetup groups, and I said, oh, we go out drinking. We go out to the pub and we just chat, and it's very sociable, and it's very inviting, but it's also challenging to people because they don't necessarily know what Mad Studies is, or what context, or what to expect when they come to a Mad Studies meetup.
I mean, behind it, sort of the idea was to say that Mad Studies, in our view at least, should almost be like the Hearing Voices movement is, in a sense, but broader. That it's not just an academic discipline that's happening there. No, it's actually its own thing, because it's outside the academy anyway. It supersedes the academy because it's dealing with what is acceptable knowledge, what's not acceptable knowledge. It's dealing with all of these issues of sanity, rationality, and so forth. They're outside the academy anyway. And like providing a space in which people can just come and discuss and openly investigate and talk about their experiences, but not just Hearing Voices, but more broad, whatever that includes, and whatever discussion is involved in that, seems to be like really important these days. Unfortunately, just what we've seen is that there hasn't been that much interest in it. But I mean, just to say that, sort of like,
partly because people aren't familiar with it, and I also
exactly. I mean, the point is to sort of we have to build up this idea that Mad Studies isn't just an academic discipline; it's centrally a sort of its own thing, its own opportunity, its own.
Yeah, and it's really been fascinating. The people who do come to the group bring their stories with them and share their stories, and it is a very powerful space in terms of, again, solidarity, finding other people who have had similar experiences and can relate, and are not going to stigmatize your experience or judge you harshly because of it, and it's we're trying to grow it. We're trying to grow our connection with the community in terms of bringing Mad Studies out of the academy and out into the community.
I mean, as it says on the slides here, like bridging versus bordering, this kind of idea draws on sort of Gloria Anzaldúa's work, some people might be familiar with. But the idea here is that sort of rather than Mad Studies being sort of like, or Mad Studies students kind of going in the academy and then coming back to the community, or going into sort of hospitals even eventually, and drawing and sort of being in that space between bridging the academy and bridging the community. It's sort of, no, Mad Studies should be its own space in this border territory, because we're in the borderlands here between rationality, irrationality, between academy, between a community, sanity, madness. We're in this sort of border space, and that's kind of what we're opening up ideally with Mad Studies, is that. But I mean, crucially, it's sort of important to remember that border spaces, whether psychical or physical, are not safe spaces, or like they're difficult spaces to be in, and there will be that it's very difficult for them to be sort of like trauma informed or safe or brave or any of these terms. It's very difficult for these Mad Studies kind of spaces, or these bordering spaces, to be really safe. And unfortunately, because of like much of the time sort of communities related to psychosis or bipolar and these kind of things end up being sort of framed as support groups or mental health groups and so forth, and they aren't just spaces that are just sort of default acceptance of everything, come, free speech, open, discuss, study, but with the awareness that this might be difficult for you, it might be challenging, you might not agree with a lot of what people see, people might not give you good advice, blah blah blah. They're not safe spaces. Border spaces are always inherently sort of barbed in wire and danger, and so, but that's part of their potentiality too, is that's there.
Well, we can open up the space now. We've got another 5 minutes that we've got to this level, another 5 minutes for the local level, sitting on the floor. And again, are there any questions or any comments that anyone wants to chime in?
Tara Lay had asked a question. I think it was related to the first slide, but they write, how does mainstream psychiatric care disrupt this process or aid in it?
Well, again, that I would say that it is, as Jesse said, a shutting down process. It's an interruptive process. It doesn't wait to let the experience unfold. It is very much about stifling an experience, defining it instantly as a negative experience, as a problem that needs to be fixed. And we can say that in the local level as well, that madness is very poorly understood in our communities. It's seen as an antisocial problem rather than a experience that many people in communities have, and that is
also, it's wrapped in,
of
assumptions,
community.
but also wrapped in assumptions of danger, much of the time too, that, that somehow people having these experiences, or that there's something inherently dangerous about them, and, likely to lead to violence or disruption, whereas, the evidence sort of clearly shows that people having any kind of experience that might be labeled as mad are much more likely to be victims of harm themselves than they are to cause harm to others. So yeah, I think the other thing that we mentioned already before is that, psychiatry isn't just crucial in terms of sort of shutting down experiences, perhaps it literally physically or whatever, but also sort of epistemically, that it's involved in framing the experiences anyway. And so people, if they hear voices or if they have some kind of altered experience, the frameworks they have available to draw on are already negative, pathological, distress related, and so forth. And so they don't have something available to them to draw on that's more open and more sort of perhaps even just more easygoing in some way, in terms of a discourse that they can draw on that isn't just going to sort of reinforce paranoia and suspicion and danger and so forth, because psychiatry is crucial. It's when we talk about paranoid schizophrenia, for example, and people ending up with paranoid delusions, it's like, well, much of the time those paranoid delusions are clearly justified in relation to the fact that they are in danger of having their experiences shut down, they are in danger of being incarcerated, they are in danger of being force medicated, etc., etc. And so they have total justification for being paranoid about the situation. And obviously, perhaps the content of the delusions themselves might be whatever and difficult, but or not necessarily rational or whatever within existing frameworks, but nevertheless the actual paranoia at the core of their experiences seems to be often being produced by the fact that they are in a context in which they're going to be subject to surveillance and control anyway. So what can you expect? And if people, yeah, like I said before multiple times, that one of the things that we should obviously be doing with psychosis experience, and I've been saying this, we can't do this in the UK at the moment, but in response to these kinds of experiences, it's like, where currently do we have that sort of is the best context for people having altered experiences or psychotic experiences to go at the moment? Well, from my understanding, probably an ayahuasca camp. And that's not to say to go and take ayahuasca. That's just the fact that ayahuasca camps, as an experience, sort of phenomenologically, the experience of ayahuasca and psychosis probably they're pretty close. I mean, that's why, you know, we used to call them psychotomimetics or psychedelics psychotomimetics, and there's something very similar about them. Obviously, they're not the same, and there are significant differences and nuances and so forth. But at the same time, as a context in which somebody might be able to actually live through the experience of psychosis or madness or whatever in a more, you know, forgiving and compassionate context, well, then that's just available. So I don't see why we're not already, like Spain, for example, where they have ayahuasca camps, where it's like, can we not just begin sort of trialing this? Just, you know, just give them a space in which people can live through these experiences, and where they're provided a framework that isn't demanding pathology out of them, you know? Anyway.
We have a couple questions in the chat. The first is from Maxine, and she writes, or they write, could it be that mental health services perceive unusual experiences as problematic because it's only when situations in relationship become problematic that mental health services are asked to intervene?
I would agree with that. Our systems that we have in place now don't support families and communities and friends in a way that the structures we have in place in our communities are psychiatric, and there's so much potential to develop community services that do not intervene through a medical model. I think is the Trieste project in Italy not similar to that, where there's a much more inviting culture in terms of bringing people together to find solutions and to allow the space for this experience to exist rather than confining it. And I think in a way, you know, absolutely these experiences cause stress and strain on relationships and people, but in a way it's because our society is set up to expect us all to fit in, and to fit in according to schedules, and to go to work and to be available. And
at the same time, it's like you just need somewhere. I mean, at some point, sometimes perhaps you do just need a respite. You need somewhere for people to go. And obviously, the worst place that they can go is a psychiatric hospital, where they're going to just be traumatized and end up in a much more difficult position anyway. I mean, or most of the time, it seems to be the case that the current spaces we have available to actually live through these experiences are just not helpful to anybody.
They're not very inviting. They're very clinical. And there is a lot to be said about how to change the, you know, the vibe of where you're staying into a more comfortable, inviting space rather than a very clinical, institutional space would make a big difference, I think.
Before just checking in before moving on, we have one more question from Tara
Okay.
Lay. What about the societies of privileged individuals who have access to exploit populations and observe individuals? The voices that some people hear are not within our heads. It's coming from an external source. The stigma is so severe, it's not believed. It's the biggest kept secret.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come back to that in the last section, actually. So we'll talk a bit about that. Before we do, yeah, so just sitting back in your chair if you haven't moved up. So thinking about this at sort of the national level, thinking about this in relation to our governments, the political too. One of the things I think Mad Studies sort of opens up again is this whole discussion of social control. Various sort of anti-psychiatrists obviously brought this discussion up, but Mad Studies brings it back into the picture in a very sort of clear, fundamental way to say that we have to understand that, you know, if we understand madness sort of sociologically, anthropologically, it's always a social, cultural, historically contingent construct. And at the moment, the way that it's being approached, you know, with regards to sort of psychiatric incarceration, you know, forced treatment, etc., is really a form of social control at its core.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thread to follow. And there's a book that's just been published by called Mad World by Mika Fraser Carroll, I think is their name. And it studies the concept of madness through the lens of capitalist framework, and how state structures, essentially. And it's a really good book. I recommend it.
I mean, the other thing that I brought up a lot during the Mad Studies stuff is to say that what it has brought up to me in relation to psychiatry much of the time is that it's important to remember that psychiatry basically operates at its purest, politically speaking, and you can sort of draw on the idea of sluggish schizophrenia, which is often brought up in anti-psychiatry in sort of the Soviet Union, and how politicized psychiatry is. And even sort of David Cooper, who's sort of a famous anti-psychiatrist, talked about all delusion as political delusion, you know, just as sort of all prisoners are political prisoners, which is a similar phrasing. But the idea is that sort of crucially, psychiatry provides a mechanism by which the state can extrajudicially incarcerate or contain somebody's behavior or thought, thinking, and so forth. In other words, the psychiatry facilitates this extrajudicial process of a state of exception in which the state always has this overarching sort of absolute power to detain anybody it wishes at any time, effectively, with a justification from psychiatry, right? And so the simple existence of psychiatry is this constant state of exception, which Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher, talks a lot about, but or which is drawn from Carl Schmitt. But like the politics of it is that when you open this up, it's sort of Mad Studies kind of exposes the fact that this is sort of fundamental to our societies, is that, or even a colonialist society, is that it must have this function available to it to arbitrarily or sort of outside the existing rules be able to say that somebody's behavior is worthy of being controlled or contained.
Let's open up the floor again, because we're running a little bit over our time. Let's open up the floor to any questions that have to do with the national level and the ideas about how Mad Studies relates to state.
Contributor.
I see a question, but is advocating for mad anarchy a responsible stance? Well,
I don't think we're advocating for. I'm not advocating for mad anarchy. I don't know.
And my understanding of anarchy is that it is about freedom, not about destruction, and that mad anarchy would be the freedom to be and to behave according to how you are experiencing reality. I don't know very much about anarchism, but there's a lot of scholarship around it that it'd be very interesting to study Mad Studies in connection to anarchist scholarship.
I mean, I just think one of the questions that Mad Studies does raise, though, in relation to this is sort of social thresholds, perhaps, which are also varied across cultures, in terms of at what point do you say that somebody's behavior or thinking or whatever has somehow crossed the line in relation to it being necessary to detain or control or whatever that person, if they haven't broken the law, for example, in many cases, right? That somehow their behavior has become like. I mean, I know like the sociologist Thomas Sheff talks about sort of mental illness or madness as being sort of the violation of residual social norms, and this idea that sort of it's where is your threshold for that as a society, and perhaps our threshold is just too sort of, we're not tolerant enough, and this means that we're actually impeding social change and paradigm shifts and progress because we're not actually allowing people to have experiences that would actually open things up in a way that might move us past the sort of like, you know, capitalist realist sort of situation that we've arrived at, where we can't actually think of alternatives because we have constrained ourselves so much, and sort of perhaps psychiatry's involvement in constraining things in that way.
Could we move to level 4 and sort of step into that realm, because we want to keep going?
Yeah, so lastly, we're gonna stand up. This is difficult because my camera is in my keyboard anyway. So thinking about this from a global perspective, one of the key things that Mad Studies we thought sort of brings into picture too is this whole issue of post-colonialism. There's a lot of Mad Studies scholars and academics seem to be drawing a lot on post-colonialist work, and it provides very interesting ideas about things, particularly perhaps, I mean, what I thought was been interested in reading into this sort of stuff is really the idea that sort of psychiatry, psychology, all of the side disciplines go hand in hand with colonialism, in the sense of creating an objective human subject to study in the first place. I mean, I know Foucault talks about this, but the fact that like people were before psychology didn't really exist as a discipline, at least until people were contained in an asylum and became objects of study. And once they were objectified, then they became this object of study. And so breaking with this idea of human subjects as being objects of study seems to be important. And that's involved in this whole sort of idea of post-colonialism, really. But I mean, so much of what's happened as a result of colonialism goes hand in hand with psychiatry and psychology in terms of the exportation of sort of Western subjectivity into other people's, or not other people, in other cultures' sort of context in which they already had these developed ideas and models and approaches to, you know, altered states, hearing voices, whatever. Even they probably weren't even framed in those terms, but you know, different cultures have had different approaches to this, and through the exportation of Western subjectivity, and like there's this sort of epistemic violence, this ontologic violence that has been committed historically against cultures in terms of how these experiences can be approached.
I've seen some comments come through. Michelle, can you help draw those into the conversation so we can respond?
Absolutely. So both come from Mike. The first one is, I was institutionalized for 17 years. Had I not been, I would have unleashed my madness on the community. And they also write, it's about normalization. Social justice discourses are normalizing in their own way.
That's true. I'm intrigued by the first comment because I wonder what unleashing madness on a society involves, and why a society doesn't have space. Why using the word unleashed is quite interesting. Where do we have space in our society for alternate experiences, for anomalous experiences? Where in our culture do we invite different experiences that are not part of consensual reality?
Looks like Mike responded by saying physical aggression. Andrea writes, there are definitely voices from an external source that makes me a channeler when I write it down.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think that's one way of approaching these things. I mean, from many people with lived experience sort of share the idea that there's an externality involved there, that there must be some sort of underlying external truth to these things. I think they can also be approached in other ways, but I mean, I guess back to the sort of post-colonial stuff, connecting to what they asked earlier. But yeah, I mean, the idea that many cultures do have hearing voices framed in this way. I mean, there was a good study by, I can't remember her first name, Lerman, that looked at this and just saw how the hearing voices was experienced differently by Americans, some population in Africa and some population in India, and how in Africa, where they were perceived as external sources usually from the divine, that these voices were coming from a divine source, that generally people had a more positive experience with the voices, whereas in the US, or where they looked at the people of having hearing voices, they were generally experienced as persecutory and punishing and so forth. And then interestingly, when they looked at the individuals in Chennai in India, they found that people who were experiencing voices generally found them to be some source of guidance. And they didn't really see them as positive or negative, but they did see them as guiding. And so you can see how different cultural approaches can actually affect the experience themselves. Like Lerman calls it social kindling. But I think that's important in relation to that. But I mean, the point is that sort of in relation to post-colonialism is because we've sort of, in the West, we end up sort of always universalizing our own knowledge base or our own understanding of subjectivity, that we sort of somehow think that universally these experiences are understood in the same way, or can be understood in the same way, and we're constantly imposing this model on what are rich and very interesting ways of approaching these experiences from other cultures. I mean, it was interesting when you connect this to the work of somebody like can't remember her first name either, Federici, where she talks about the sort of she wrote a book about Caliban and the Witch, and she talked about how sort of there was sort of a war on magic against witches before the sort of birth of capitalism. They had to clear away the sort of potentiality that underlay this more open sort of idea about the nature of reality and so forth, that sort of underlied witchcraft, basically, magic and all of those things, and that wrapped up in psychiatry and I mean, I often say that psychiatry seems to be sort of almost the overlord, you could say, of the episteme. Like they are sort of the sort of real sort of authority that underlies what's acceptable in terms of our perceptions of reality, because they're the ultimate arbiters of that.
Can we bring in any other comments, Michelle, before we come to our conclusion? I know our time is starting to, we've got just a few minutes left of the session.
We have two. One's from Mike. Mike writes, yet colonialism brought the anthropological discourses to the colonized discourses that empower the colonized. And the second comment.
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, particularly in relation to, I mean, I know David Graeber in The Dawn of Everything wrote about this, but the idea that sort of it was really the whole Enlightenment was actually a result of the engagement with indigenous knowledge. That the very idea of inequality didn't exist until basically the indigenous communities put a mirror up to Western civilization at the time and said, like, how are your societies so horrifying? Why do you treat people so badly? And then the sort of Rousseau takes on that, and the whole sort of Enlightenment emerges as a result of this contact with indigenous knowledge. So absolutely, in terms of I mean, but then dangerously, yeah, that then becomes a source of empowerment in some way for colonialism too. Yeah.
Another comment comes from Tara Lay. Tara Lay writes, the problem is some people having these voices are alive and well, observing individuals, tracking and influencing during a sedated state such as sleep. Privacy is gone and no accountability for this.
Mm. I think that's
Yeah, it's hard.
pointed.
In my own, it's just, again, this is a mad studies space. But if I was personally responding to that, I'd be thinking about it because I personally have quite a big interest in sort of Dharma and sort of Buddhist approaches to things, and seeing just the fact that these are just experiences arising in consciousness, and they're sort of just coming and going and arising, and that you don't think your thoughts think you anyway. And so like what was a question? The idea of them being external, the idea of voices being external in the first place relies on this dichotomization of internal, external, this dualism that doesn't, if you actually sort of examine it critically from a sort of phenomenological point of view, it doesn't actually exist. And so if you get into sort of a non-dualist understanding of the nature of mind or reality, that can help break perhaps with this idea that the voices are always coming from an external source rather than just sort of just existing, just as thoughts are just arising, everything is just arising and flowing anyway. And there is no self anyway that would be affected by these thoughts. But
Mike commented, a Buddhist informed Mad Studies sounds very promising.
Yeah, hopefully we can move forward with that.
And Tara Lay commented, internal is something inside of you. External is something happening to, I believe, you or to.
There is no you for something to happen to. The you is just arising anyway in consciousness, which in consciousness is all of this experience that's unfolding right now. This requires getting into sort of non-dualist understandings of the nature of reality that perhaps is quite difficult in this context.
But still very inviting and interesting to pursue.
Definitely.
Yeah. We've just got 2 minutes to go, so I wonder if we can just conclude our session and again just highlight the 4 levels that Jesse introduced, of 4 levels of analysis. Level 1 being the personal, level 2 being the local, level 3 being the national, and level 4 being the global. And again, to invite people to engage with Mad Studies in whatever way feels possible and tempting to you, because it is very much a project that is emerging and growing and takes everybody's voices, respects everybody's voices and contributions, and definitely invites dialogue and exploration. Wouldn't you say?
Just to say, yeah, crucially, I think that Mad Studies can be it's a way of, because the Hearing Voices movement is such a sort of great idea and success and has had a lot of success, but perhaps it's just too narrow, really, in the sense of opening up really spaces in which we can sort of deal with all of the things that end up being labeled as mad in a way, and having an open space in which we can sort of study those things together outside the academy, and in the community, but not, that we're in this border territory. Yeah, but everywhere. Yeah, but that we can have these, we could have these community spaces. Ideally, you could envision a Mad Studies movement that would involve much more much more meetups and much more of these kinds of things, giving people the opportunity to just come together and share their experiences, talk about them, get other people's perspectives in an open, free, challenging, disruptive in some way, dangerous sometimes context.
Yeah. Start your own meetup groups in your own local areas. Invite conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Julia and Jesse, for presenting this excellent presentation and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you all to the virtual participants for joining in and listening and for your contributions today. I hope everyone has a great day today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.